It lay on a tiny island the guys couldn't stop staring at during the trip, and the guy wanted Lime to leave their squad. The young man hadn't expected that. He was taken aback and blurted out, "What do you mean?" He cut through the formalities, answered bluntly, and repeated his request to him again. About 2 years ago, the hero was invited to join a group of adventurers, and now the mole demanded that he leave. The team stood together. The mole leader, the strongman warrior Jack, the sorceress Emily, and of course the young man himself. The young man asked the head of the group to put the reason together and give a little more detail. It had all happened so suddenly. If he leaves, the squad will lose the valuable growth skill he reminded the leader about. The mole was utterly sure of his decision, so sure that even that skill had become unimportant. They didn't need it anymore. As panic rose, the hero felt his confidence in his arguments begin to crumble. Back in the land of Eden, everyone was born with some kind of skill. Skills came in all sorts of shapes. Everyday ones like the power to find lost things. Battle ones like strong man. And some even seemed like curses, such as clumsiness, while others felt like pure luck. Lime's exceptional growth skill was also incredibly rare. Everything around it began to speed up. Adventurers leveled up much faster, and even killing a single monster gave them 3 times the experience. Even animals and plants were touched by the skill. The young man's cattle and vegetables grew big and healthy. For a plain villager like him, that skill was incredibly useful, and it was exactly that talent that caught the eye of a band of adventurers who kept urging him to join them. After a moment's thought, he realized that after joining, the mole and the others had leapt up in level, and he was surprised that such a skill was no longer needed. The leader gave a tight nod. That good growth had been useful, but they had already become strong enough. Lately, the guys haven't been leveling up. They must have already hit the level cap. In the end, Lime's skill wasn't needed anymore, and on the battlefield the adventurers just shrugged it off as useless. And to be blunt, money's been poured into it before. The mole saw the young man's worth as not just 0 but below 0. The hero seethed. How could they do this to him while he was tied up with other work instead of using his ability? A young man did all the cooking, washing, and buying of supplies. Jack roared at his former comrade to stop showing off, refusing to believe he was useful because the warrior thought him too weak to beat any monsters. Emily and her friends are a top-quality squad, and the girl wanted to make that plain to the young man. Lion himself was going to keep staying with them as a simple handyman, and after that I compared his behavior to a parasite. When he first joined them, their words left him speechless. Everyone was so low level that even handling the weak felt like a struggle. Thanks to Lime's ability, their levels kept rising again and again, and before long the guys became S-rank heroes who handled the toughest missions with ease. When the adventurers reached their limit, they dismissed him as useless and mocked him, their jokes cutting deep as a hot anger began to boil up inside him. The mole tried to make him understand on his own that now they'd have to tackle tougher tasks. The trip ahead already bristled with danger, and it was simply impossible to protect the, quote, burden. So the group leader told the guy to do whatever he wanted. He was sure there'd be people who'd need a chance to grow, and they even offered Lime the option to return to his native village or find a job somewhere. The adventurers headed for the moored ship to carry on their journey. The leader gave one last wave, and that was it. The hero stood on the dock, watching the ship pull away with his former comrades aboard. He sat and turned this burden's nickname over in his mind. Yes, his skill in battle was useless, but that didn't mean anyone had to speak to him so harshly. And now the real question was what the young man should do next. The island he stood on now wasn't even the island he'd been born on. The Kingdom of Eden spread across a chain of islands, and this one, Haramoa, only ever saw adventurers passing through on their way. He had to catch a regular flight to the mainland to get out, but they'd thrown Lime out so suddenly he was nearly penniless, and with no money you can't even board a ship. He realized there was nothing to be done at the port, so he packed his things and headed off. A sudden idea hit him. Find a farmer who could give him work, and he groaned with regret, thinking that if he'd known this would happen, he would have asked for a severance package. Something suddenly landed on his head, and he looked up with a scowl, outraged, and to top it off, it was starting to rain. As if he'd heard those words, he sprinted harder, and the rain turned into a fierce downpour. The hero could only pull his arms over his head. He had to wait it out somewhere. He spotted houses up ahead and slipped into one to hide. Soaked to the skin, he stepped inside and desperately thought that even the weather had turned its back on him. Then an unmistakable sound came from deep within the building, startling Lime even more. He found the cows and realized he'd wandered into the cowshed. The guy walked along the stall, and it struck him as odd. All the animals were gaunt, their fur thin and patchy, and their udders in terrible shape. He felt sorry for them. Worry tightened around Lime as she kept wondering what could have happened to the owner of this place. But suddenly a voice cut through from behind, shouting, "Who is he?" They turned out to be two beastmen children, glowering at the intruder, afraid he had come to catch them. But Lime wasn't any less surprised when he caught sight of the ears and tail. He instantly recognized the look of beastmen, the dog boy and the cat girl, and both of them looked openly hostile. The hero raised his hands in a harmless, calming gesture and apologized for scaring him. He just wanted to wait out the rain, and the children were surprised by the explanation. The boy jabbed a stick forward and screamed at the young man to shut his mouth. He refused to believe him when he said he'd wait out the downpour, and even if he wanted to, he could go home. The beastman still believed the hero had come to take the milk, or else he was a thief there to steal it. When the youngster mentioned the milk thief, Lime's eyes lit up. This had to be their stall. He sank onto a heap of hay on the floor, brushing off their guesses and insisting he only wanted to wait for the rain to end. The children's faces flipped from hostile and aggressive to a stunned, pitying mix. The girl called the guest brother and asked if he was lost. The hero froze, surprised they could think of him that way. But when you really think about it, maybe that fit. He told them that in fact his comrades had left him. The cackerel was filled with worry that no one would pick him up now. The guy was painfully alone, and she suddenly realized he had been abandoned. The young man agreed with her, and before he knew it, exactly that happened to him. She thought it over and then realized the young man was in the same situation as they were, and he was surprised when he heard they'd compared him to them. The boy's voice trembled as he explained that he and Millie had been abandoned by the adults. Lime stared at the girl, puzzled. She nodded and confirmed her brother's words. They really lived in a cowshed. My brother told me how they lived in a big house, until one day they were suddenly brought to an abandoned island. The hero instantly thought it must be the grand house of some aristocrat. Lately she could keep beautiful beastmen as a sign of her status. Those children were probably brought to the mansion for exactly that. But beast-like people were far stronger than ordinary folks, and treating them like human children only invited accidents. On top of that, they have animal habits. Dogs needed daily walks and cats needed scratching posts. People often said they were simply abandoned the moment they became too much trouble. Apparently, the person who owned those children had done the very same thing. Thinking of him, the guy remembered his old friends. People like that were rare, selfish to the bone. Millie and her brother were still very small, and the hero guessed they were only about 5 or 6 years old. If no one cares for them, the children will most likely die from their heads, Lime thought sadly. Then the young man took a breath, stepped forward, introduced himself, and asked for their names. The boy's name was Ryu, the girl's was Millie, and even with his own problems, the young man couldn't help feeling glad to meet them. All three were abandoned. Their meeting felt like fate, and the young man, straightening the haybed, wanted to do everything he could. When he finished the preparations, it revealed the bed he'd made for everyone, and the brother and sister stood there, stunned and confused that anyone would go to such trouble for them. The guy showed me how to stack the hay just right so it stayed warm and soft. Ryu praised their new friend, and his sister thanked him for his hard work. It was time to go to bed. The rain hadn't stopped, and the young man, worn out from the long day, felt completely spent. As he drifted off, he caught the smell of hay, a strange, aching nostalgia for a young man who had never slept in a bed like that before. On the brink of sleep, he pushed everything down until only that scent and his heavy tiredness remained. And that night he fell into a strange dream. Lime and the children slept peacefully on their makeshift bed, and even the nearby cows had drifted into the same gentle sleep. A strange tug in his dream yanked the young man awake as a heavy weight pressed down from above. And then, without warning, a tiny fist flew into his face, hitting him hard and sending a jolt of pain through him. When he got up, he saw his brother and sister. And then it hit him. They were the ones making him feel so heavy, because they'd been sleeping on top of him. He had no choice but to pull them closer and wrap them more thickly in the hay so they'd feel warmer. And after that, the guy lay back down. When he first made the bed, the children stared at it and ran their hands over it with delight. It felt so soft to them. Lime never imagined things would end up like this. Now there's the nagging question of how to feed them. But he pushed it aside until he wakes up. The clock read 3:58. The hero leapt onto the bed, shouting that it was milking time. As he buttoned his suit, he fumed at being late again while the farm lay quiet in the pale light of an early morning. He pulled his cap on as he stepped into the building and called out a quick "good morning" to a colleague, who, hearing him arrive, immediately remarked on his lateness. Then he warned the young man not to scream loudly. Mistress the cow might get scared. He apologized, and his colleague told him to pull himself together. He's the farm's heir, after all. The hero couldn't wait to get started. Fujisawa Lime came from a family of farmers stretching back generations. For as long as anyone could remember, the Fujisawa farm had been theirs, and now the young man was studying to take over the business. Lately, running the farm has gotten tougher, so the family opened a cozy little cafe selling cheese, butter, soft serve ice cream, and many other treats. They jumped into all sorts of other activities, like taking guided tours around the farm. When Lime was still just an intern, he spent his days tending cows and helping out at the cafe. He knew that one day he'd have to take charge of everything, but for now he didn't think he was good enough at the job. Yet he already loved every bit of it. The senior colleague watched the young man at work and praised him for a job well done. Pre-milking is a job you have to do before the milk starts flowing. First, give the cow a soft touch on her hind legs so she knows milking is about to begin. Next, place the bucket under the ether. Wipe it down with a clean towel, disinfect your hands, then give it a light rub. We had to check whether the animal had cystitis or something else. But there was another reason that mattered even more. When you gently touch a cow's udder with warm hands, she produces the happy hormone oxytocin, and that makes it easier for the milk to come out. The young cows hardly ever got sick, ate heartily, and were so easy to care for. Lime soothed the impatient cow with a promise she'd be next, and once a quick pre-milking proves everything is normal, you can connect the milking machine. Lime's mentor watched how the young man moved and what he did, and to his eyes the young man seemed clumsy. He couldn't make sense of it, how the guy was so good at everything yet kept being late. And the young man apologized, saying it was just hard for him to get up early. He decided to stop talking about it and suggested they move on to the next tasks, cleaning the head of the couch and feeding. Since childhood, Lime's father had drilled into him 3 important things. Make milking comfortable for the cows, always collect clean, raw milk, and keep the cows from getting sick. He told his son to think of cows as princesses. Look after them well, and they'll give you delicious milk. And so the young man lived on a farm, scraping by in conditions that were far from ideal. After a hard day's work, the hero crawled into bed, feeling he'd done a good job, and sleep took him in an instant. But then it hit him. He had to set the alarm, or he'd risk oversleeping again. The young man blinked awake at the sight of morning, scrambled upright in bed, panicked that he'd missed milking time, then suddenly froze and stared ahead with a questioning, puzzled look. A cow still stood in the stall before him, and he remembered that he'd been hiding from the rain in this cowshed last night and had fallen asleep right there. The girl also woke to his movements and asked the young man if anything had happened. He smiled and whispered a warm good morning to Millie as she, still half asleep, rubbed her eyes. At the same time, a sudden thought struck him. The brother and sister were still there. The hero whispered sorry for waking her, but the cat was already at the window, staring out at the pleasant weather. He followed her lead, peering out to see how things were outside since he hadn't been up to it before. And then a startled look crossed his face. The young man froze, shock pinning him to the spot as he looked out. The clearing stretched surprisingly wide, vast even with the dense thicket around it. Lime ran a hand over the grass. It felt pretty good, and if the spot were tidied up, you could even graze cattle there. He knew it was all true, but a cold worry gnawed at him. How could he understand farming so well when he'd never done this kind of work? He remembered a recent dream, and it felt disturbingly real. Lime figured these might be memories from a past life when he worked on a farm. He shoved the thought aside and called Millie over to ask if the farm had a manager, but the girl herself didn't really know. She added that she and her brother had been there for about a month, and still no one had come. The young man blinked, surprised it had taken so little time, and asked her what they had been eating all this while. Millie and Rue drank milk when they were hungry. They sank down in this clearing, and the young man decided this place was truly abandoned. Suddenly an idea struck Lime. This might be his chance. Maybe it was memories from a past life or something stranger. But somehow the young man already knew how to talk to cows. On top of that, the hero had a huge advantage. He had a quote, height. If he could restore this abandoned farm, he'd finally be able to provide for himself. The young man refused to face that again. The sting of friends turning their backs. And above all, he couldn't stand to hear those same insulting words ever again. He realized his old comrades had just used him and left him, and the thought made his blood boil. Suddenly he sprang to his feet, determined to rely only on himself from now on. Millie beside him was scared, her voice trembling as she asked what might have happened to him. Lucky for Lime, the bare-bones set of tools was already there, albeit an old one. Not wanting to delay any longer, he got down to business. The children came up and asked with eager interest what the young man was doing, and the hero explained that he was cleaning the cowshed. He felt bad keeping the animals in such a dirty place. If everything was cleaned, they'd give delicious milk, and the children loved the idea, shouting with joy. The hero begged them to join the case, asking for their help. The sooner they succeeded, the better. Ryu agreed cheerfully, even telling them to count on him. But his sister didn't want to stand idle either, so he quickly found them a task. Gather the old straw and carry it outside. They flung themselves onto a basket of hay, desperate and ready to do anything for a drop of milk. Lime was taken aback by how quick they were, so much tougher than human children. The fresh hay looked brand new. The guy started laying out the straw. He thanked the guys. Everything was much cleaner now, and the boy beamed with pride, saying they tried their best. Next, the young man had to fetch water for them. A well stood nearby, but he still had to see if it actually worked. After straining to shove the lever down, the guy noticed how badly rusted it was. Ryu realized Lime couldn't handle the case alone, so he stepped up and volunteered to help. They both dug in and shoved the handle with all their strength until it finally gave way. Water gushed into the bucket in a wild rush, and the children were delighted. The hero rubbed his forehead and let out a long, relieved sigh. At least they had some water now, good enough for household needs. However, he also understood that they couldn't sleep with the cows, and his guys fell on the house that stood to the side. The young man opened the door and stepped into a house whose interior was unexpectedly shabby. Inside it was a wreck, and the hero and the children started coughing from the piled-up dust and debris. But there was nothing to be done, and Lime offered to clean it thoroughly. You could hardly breathe just being there. First, they fling open the windows to drive out every speck of dust, arm themselves with cleaning tools, and tie handkerchiefs over their faces. Then haul the trash out and scrub the floor with a brush. Then wipe everything with a cloth. The children, full of glee, crawled all over the floor in every direction, rubbing it as they went. After a while, when the guy finished cleaning, the house literally sparkled with cleanliness. Ryu and Millie's eyes sparkled with delight, and the young man noticed that, though the furnishings were sparse, the place felt surprisingly cozy. The brother and sister smiled with relief. At last they had a home for everyone. The boy was especially happy. He could finally sleep peacefully. Suddenly a rumbling sound rolled out, their empty stomachs growling as the guy remembered they hadn't eaten in a long time. Millie admitted they had almost no food left, and Ryu felt a knot of worry about what they should do now. Lime encouraged the children, confident they'd come up with something now that they'd all be living together. He mentored the kids. Now that they'll be living on the farm, they can't rely on anyone else. They'll have to do everything themselves, even getting their own food. The guys clutched their empty stomachs, but doubt still lingered. Could they really pull it off? The young man reassured them with a promise to teach them everything and urged them to look for something edible first. The brother-and sister began to look around, her eyes darting as she searched for something. A strange smell grabbed Ryu, pulled him to a small locker, and the boy climbed in to check. It turned out to be salt and pepper, which made the new tenants very happy. The young man praised him, and his brother chuckled that one should not dislike animal instinct. He asked if that would be enough, but Lime wanted to use spices to cook the food. Now with the condiments in hand, the guys hurried outside to take a look. The farm was so vast, there had to be edible herbs and mushrooms tucked away somewhere. The hero thought about teaching the children how to tell what was safe to eat and what wasn't. It had to be done if anything happened to him. Strolling through the forest, the friends found a dandelion, some parsley, and a sprig of wormwood. To their delight, it was all edible. He barked at Ryu to watch and memorize, but the boy's eyes had already slipped away to something else. He excitedly pulled out 2 big mushrooms with spotted caps. The kid asked Lime if they could be eaten. The hero kept thinking about it because on his journey he'd seen monsters that looked like those mushrooms, and they were really dangerous. He pointed at the other mushrooms and warned that the flashy ones are often dangerous, while the edible ones hide like this, plain and easy to miss. The boy's face crumpled, and the guy called out to Millie to memorize it too. Then suddenly, the girl called Lime spoke in a drawing voice. Only her ears peeked out of the grass as she searched for the young man and her brother. Ryu's stomach twisted with worry as he wondered what his sister might be doing there. A lone voice drifted up from the grass, and the sight was oddly, strangely out of place. The hero scooped Millie into his arms, apologizing that he shouldn't have been so distracted. The girl's face lit up as she was lifted so high she wanted to go even higher, and Lime hesitantly agreed. The young man lifted her onto his neck to spin her around, but Millie began to squirm and wildly swing her arm, which could throw him off balance, so he asked her to be careful. My sister shouted to my brother that it was really fun and invited me to try it too, and the boy snorted with displeasure, turned away, saying he wasn't interested in this. But it was obvious. Despite what he said, he was interested anyway, because he kept trying to peek. He silently apologized to himself. He couldn't lift 2 people. The girl spotted juicy fruits on the tree and wide-eyed immediately wondered what it could be. It was a cherry, a tiny berry so tasty you could stir it into jam or tuck it into pies. The moment the girl heard that, she leaped to her feet, eager to try it out. The guy warned her that it was dangerous, but Millie reassured him. She was very good at climbing trees. Lime watched, more and more amazed. In the blink of an eye, the girl had climbed so high, moving like a cat. She picked a berry, held it up to study it for a heartbeat, then bit into it. She bobbed her head this way and that. The cherry was both sour and sweet, and she liked it, while Ryu downstairs asked his sister not to eat everything herself. Hearing his request, the girl tossed down some berries. Lime and Ryu were busy picking fruits in bowls. The young man thanked Millie and asked her to stop throwing them off. There was already enough. He praised his brother and sister. They had both done a good job, and together they'd managed to gather wild herbs and mushrooms, even cherries for dessert, which was pretty good. Next, the hero began teaching the children how to build a hearth, showing them how to stack big stones into a circle. Then he showed how to stack the firewood just right so it would burn well, and how to tuck straw and dry leaves inside as kindling before setting it alight. Ryu and Millie watched the fire with wide-eyed wonder, but the young man just shrugged. He saw nothing special in it. He remembered how Emily could light a fire with a flick of magic, and because of that, Lime learned how to cook in a pot. He also remembered her telling him that her magic wasn't for his entertainment. When the flames settled, you could bring the water to a boil and toss in the ingredients. Then sprinkle salt, pepper, and a few other spices. The children watched the process with bright, eager eyes. The boy wanted to climb straight into the boiling pot, drawn by the wonderful smell, but the man grabbed his arm and warned him that it was hot. At last, the wild herb and mushroom soup was ready. They poured it into 3 plates, and all 3 smiled as they wished each other bon appétit. Lime and the children carefully sipped the broth, the siblings' faces lighting up with delight, and Ryu had never imagined herbs could taste so delicious. The young man grinned and agreed, and the mushrooms made it even tastier. The salty food tasted especially good after being very tired. Millie thought Lime was cool, and admired his cooking. He told her he was the one who cooked for the squad. Ryu hid his face in the plate so it couldn't be seen and said that at this rate he'd eat the whole pot, and the hero told him not to force himself. Suddenly it hit him. We can't keep feeding them only herbs and mushrooms. Kids their age need a lot to eat, so we have to cook something more nutritious. A small fishing port bobbed into view, and Lime's spirits lifted. She decided they could catch fish and shellfish there, and then milk production will stabilize. Then it would be possible to exchange it for flour and vegetables from the villagers, and thanks to this, the problems with food would be solved. Suddenly there was a sound. Everyone turned in his direction. A calf was approaching them. He suddenly realized he was running straight at the children and was dangerously close. A loud alarm rang in his head that they were in danger, and the young man shouted at them to run. The hero threw himself between Ryu and Millie, shielding them with his body. The calf was small, skinny, and slow, but it could still hurt someone. As he tried to stop it, the calf crashed into Lime, clutching at his arms. The children were very scared at that moment. The young man was surprised that even calves could hit so hard. Lime reached out with gentle words and steady hands, trying to calm the animal so it wouldn't be afraid. Next to them, the calf had nothing to whiten. No enemies stood near, and no one would dare to offend him. With a quick, light slap, the young man guided him back. Then he asked the children, "Are you okay?" She said yes, still trembling from fear, then suddenly flung herself into his arms in a hug. Sure, he was the best. He knew without doubt this man was the strongest, and now he and his sister were safe with him. The guy blinked, stunned and bewildered by whatever had suddenly seized the boy. "You're trying to coax him, aren't you?" The hero remembered how Millie, not long before, had been so happy sitting on his neck. It was obvious these children were desperately short on love. He tossed Ryu into his arms as the baby giggled, then tumbled onto a bed of hay, laughing merrily. Millie wanted to play too. She asked me for a lift since Ryu had already gotten his. Cradling the little girl in his arms, Lime ached to pour every scrap of love he had into these children. They might face hard times ahead, but he needed them more than they needed him. For the first time in so many years, the young man felt truly happy. 2 weeks have passed since then, and the farm has slowly begun to look like a real one, with all its residents working hard to help it grow. Ryu and Millie poured their hearts into it, and it helped more than they ever imagined. And maybe, thanks to Lime's skill, cows began giving milk every day. The hero stared into the future, imagining what they could achieve if this kept going. Then, out of nowhere, a boy burst in and shouted that a strange man had arrived. The young man asked him, clearly surprised. He eyed the guest, face, clothes, and was sure he was the very picture of an aristocrat, though he couldn't believe someone like that would be on the island. And the stranger stared straight at Lime. He stepped up to the guys with a quick nod, greeted them, then asked the young man if he'd put the local places in order. The young man's sudden certainty that this was the owner made his hunch snap into place. The guest asked again, pressing, how long it took to get the farm in order. The hero confessed, every word honest. It took him about 2 weeks to get it all done. The aristocrat, stunned, asked him again. He couldn't believe that in just 14 days the farm had become like this. He decided this young man must be a master, maybe even a genius. And yet the young man was taken aback by his attacks. Lime apologized, then asked, "Who are you, stranger?" The guest realized his mistake and introduced himself. "My name is Satya." It turned out that aristocrat Satya was the ruler of the island. The moment the young man heard about the ruler, he froze, and when he finally snapped out of it, he couldn't believe what he'd heard. Ryu looked worried too, but the child didn't even know what the word meant. I found myself wondering if this was really true. He dipped in a small bow. Rakway and Ryu motioned for them to do the same, and the young man then introduced himself and the children. The aristocrat told him to stop fussing so much. They were the same age. The hero hesitated but agreed, and the boy, eyes bright with pleasure, eagerly asked the lord who he was. The man pulled him back, desperate to stop him from saying too much. He urged the children to watch over the cows and bring them water. The boys went to the farm, and the young man apologized to Satya for the ward's behavior. They hadn't meant to offend him, and the lord treats them with understanding, because they were babies after all. Lime couldn't help noticing the island's ruler looked younger than he'd expected. Language asked the guy how long he'd been here, and if he'd already registered, and the young man looked up, startled to hear it. The lord was determined to gather from the island's residents their addresses, names, and other details. He needed to know exactly who lived on his land. Now Lime understood everything, and Satya, taking his time, unscrewed the top of his cane. He pulled out a roll of paper, and it turned out to be a list for collecting information that would let the lord issue a residence registration form for the islands. The hero agreed, surprised that the stick was actually a cane. The aristocrat pressed him, asking how long he intended to stay and whether he planned to move in the next 2 or 3 years. He turned the question over in his mind and decided he would live this life the way he wanted, right here on the island, and not alone but with Millie and Ryu. After a moment's thought, he asked to stay as long as he could, and the lord was pleased. In fact, word had already spread. A young man and some beastman children had settled on the farm. They'd only just arrived, but in a short time they'd turned an abandoned place into an example to follow, and the lord didn't object. Lime was glad to hear it. Satya agreed, but first there was one question to settle. Some time ago, this farm had a manager. He ran out of air and died, leaving this place behind. The villagers were all worried, didn't know what to do, and no one wanted to take on extra work. Langridge turned to the hero and asked if he thought he could restore the earth. If he pulled it off, it would be a great help to the island, and though managing the land wouldn't be easy, the lord promised to help Lime, so the hero agreed with pleasure. The lord felt the conversation was finally going his way. To send him away now would be wildly reckless, and there was no doubt it was a brilliant job of pretending. He handed the bundle of paper to the hero, and when Lime saw it, he blinked in surprise and asked, "What could it be?" When the aristocrat called it sheet tax documents, the young man snatched up the paper and read with frantic focus. It said that from the very first year on the island, taxes had to be paid to the city treasury. Looking through the papers, the young man worried that with a pasture so large he might not be able to afford the farm. The tax should have been huge, but when he saw the amount listed, he was surprised. It was so cheap. He even found himself doubting whether the numbers he'd written were really correct. Satya immediately saw the young man flush with embarrassment over such a tiny tax. It might have seemed confusing at first, but there was an explanation. The calculation was spot on. The island was dotted with abandoned villages, so land was dirt cheap. With so much open territory, the taxes were surprisingly light. Even the legends whispered it might be the cheapest domain in the country, so when the new year came, he told the hero to start paying taxes regularly. Nothing could be predicted that easily. Language was about to leave and called after the guy to bring the registration form as soon as he finished filling it out. Lime thanked him. Watching him, the hero couldn't help thinking that, for a nobleman, he didn't even have a carriage, and the guy kept wondering how he got around. Ryu and Millie crept up behind Lime and, hearts pounding, asked, "Who is the lord?" He told them, calm and sure, that he was the island's master, the boss of the whole place. The girl was stunned that something like this could happen, and Ryu enthusiastically waved his hands, calling the boss a criminal as he wondered what would happen if he started demanding money from them and if they could beat him. Lime forbade any fighting, promising the lord would take care of them, so the lord should be respected. Suddenly the girl turned to the guy and asked what was wrong with the cow, and the young man stared at her, puzzled. Millie said that every time she passed by her, she kept brushing up against her. The child couldn't understand what that could mean. The young man figured the animal might want to be milked, so he went to check it out. When you approach the cow, start by checking her condition. The girl noticed the udder was very swollen, and Lime decided she needed to be milked twice because she recovered pretty quickly. He couldn't keep doing it all alone, so the young man looked at the guys and told them that from now on, they'd be helping with the milking too. The brother and sister suddenly realized they had no idea how to do it. The hero reassured them, promising to teach them everything. He handed the girl a clean towel, then told her to first wipe with a clean cloth, and afterward to treat the udder with gentle, careful movements. Lime even gave an example of turning a cow into a princess, which needed special care. Children beamed as they held buckets brimming with milk, eagerly peering inside to see how much they had. The hero is sure that if they cared for the cows properly, the animals would give rich, delicious milk in large amounts. Millie tasted a small sip of the fresh milk, and it was delicious to her. Ryu thought cows were amazing, and the young man truly believed that if they treated those animals kindly, that kindness would come back to them. The young man urged the guys on, telling them to try harder next time. 3 days later, with the island's residence registration form finally filled out, Lime set off for Satya's estate to hand the document back. He couldn't help but admire how beautiful the aristocrat's house was, and as a lord he had every right to do so. From the balcony, the young man looked out and greeted the guest. He returned the gesture and was about to dive straight into the document, but the lord stopped him by offering tea first. The hero froze in surprise and hesitated, but he still had to trudge back to his work on the farm. The aristocrat kept insisting that everything was fine. The young man hesitated, turning it over in his mind. The brother and sister were watching the house, and maybe 1 cup of tea wouldn't hurt. The table was already set, and besides tea it was piled high with all kinds of tasty treats. Language curiously courted the guest, admiring the weather that seemed perfect for sipping tea out on the street. Lime felt a flash of surprise. This was a real tea ritual, and it would probably be rude for him to just take a cup. Also, there were delicious sweets the hero longed to treat the children to. Satya asked the guests to relax. Everything standing there had been made by his own hands. It amazed the young man, but the owner of the house insisted on doing everything himself. He leaned back in his chair and said that when he was in the capital, servants and attendants never left his side, and because of that, the lord always felt uneasy. Lime could tell right away that the young man wasn't acting like an aristocrat. He also said that people like him, the nobles, are bound by rules from the moment they're born, so they were taught at home. There were too many rules and rituals to follow, and on top of that, the constant eyes from outside, the scolding, the orders, and the suffocating pressure. Because of that, the lord had to be careful with every word and every gesture, no matter what situation he found himself in. And the young man listened, eyes wide and curious at the speaker's tales, wondering at such cases. And so, one day Satya thought of something. A thought struck the lord. What on earth was he even doing? He had to watch every move so he wouldn't stand out, couldn't say what he truly wanted, and for an aristocrat it felt like a prison. And the moment that realization hit him, the world went hollow and everything felt meaningless. On the island, your rank or where you were from meant nothing. People were judged by their actions alone, and the lord in any case just wanted to live freely. In a heartbeat, he became the ruler of those lands. After that, I decided to change my surroundings and move to the island with the Ends. He liked how things were set up there, since the formalities in that place had lost all meaning. He loved that the locals enjoyed the delicious food and that smiles never left their faces. And yet Language always likes to sit quietly and relax to his heart's content, while Lime listens to him, sipping his tea. The lord kept telling his story, fed up with a city weighed down by needless rules and searching for somewhere to let his soul rest, and the island they were on proved to be just the right place. The lord poured another steaming drink and went on with his story. How, longing for a fresh start, he decided to move and chose an island. The young man decided to stay, and Lime felt it was the right choice. The aristocrat laughed, but a small worry tugged at him. He was so comfortable there that he feared he'd forget all his manners. The hero watched him with a fond smile. This young gentleman was clearly a true lover of delicious food, and his low taxes came from cheap land, not because he wanted them that way. He couldn't even imagine there could be aristocrats this reasonable in the world. This case was truly fascinating. Language finished his story and sheepishly apologized for only talking about himself. Now it was Lime's turn. The lord flipped through the documents and saw that the young man had traveled far and wide and was part of a band of adventurers. The hero corrected him, insisting it wasn't like that, and then asked the aristocrat how he should address him. Satya remembered she'd told him this before, but the young man still looked uneasy. The young ruler insisted again, smiling, that on his island nobles and commoners were the same. Call him by his first name, the short form, just Satya. Lime agreed to this offer. He wasn't sure, but he managed to convert by name. The lord pressed the hero for stories of his adventures, but the man had almost nothing to share, especially after his exile. The listener's eyes went wide with alarm the moment he heard this. He rushed up to the young man, asking why this had happened, and the hero begged to know what was happening to him. Satya apologized. It was only a shock. But then he pressed again. Was what Lime said true? It turned out the man had been expelled without receiving any compensation, even though the aristocrat already knew from the papers that he had the skill. He couldn't understand what those people were thinking when they kicked out the tall owner. The young man hesitated, unsure what to say. Language stared in genuine shock that the hero had been kicked out. then flipped through the documents again, reading every detail. Lime's good height was a priceless ability, and that made it keep asking what the squad members were really thinking when they did this. But the young man still didn't really know himself. He kept replaying the mole's words from before they set sail, how they'd raised their levels enough. He told the other person as soon as the team members reached their peak, they no longer needed him, and he had no place among them. Suddenly, Satya asked the hero, "Do you understand your own abilities?" The young man looked at him questioningly. He believed the skill could become useless when it reached its highest peak. The Lord stood up from his seat, and when the hero's answer confirmed his guesses, he invited him to go with him to one place, the library. Upon arriving at the building, the gnome looked around with delight at the shelves piled high with books. Just what you'd expect from a nobleman. As if reading the guest's thoughts, Satya said he'd had to throw many away when he moved, so these weren't all of them. He pulled a book off the shelf and handed it to Lime. It was the latest version of the skills handbook. It contained every skill that existed in the country. The guy sank down smack in the middle of the floor, and the Lord suggested finding a quote at a good height. The skill made the target's growth rate inside its area of action jump to about 3 times normal whenever outside factors came into play, and Lime realized that was why everything around him was growing so well, even though he didn't know the exact definition. But when he thought about it, the young man couldn't wrap his head around how the mole and the others had grown so much in the 2 years they'd been together. And then another twist appeared. If a target left the action area, it picked up a growth rate debuff. The rate was cut by about 3 times from outside factors, and the chance of that effect rose with how long they stayed out of the zone. The hero was clueless about what a debuff meant, so the Lord explained bluntly. If his squad mates left him, the skill's effect would vanish and his growth would turn negative. The process grinds to a halt, muscles go limp, and work efficiency plummets. The guy blinked in disbelief. The skill's effect wasn't permanent, and Satya confirmed it wouldn't always hold. If those people got the effect of good growth within 2 months, they'd just revert to how they were before. But the Lord felt that if the hero had been with the squad for 2 years, it meant the adventurers had been regressing for about the same time. He added that from now on they'd only shrink, so they'd probably be begging the young man to come back soon. Lime was sure the mole and the others probably had no idea about it. After all, 2 years ago the guys had been pretty weak. The moment he heard the young man's group leader's name, Stacia froze. He asked Lime again. The moment the young man said yes, the Lord grabbed him by the hand. With a darkened face, Language gripped the man by the shoulders and anxiously asked, "Did he really join that party 2 years ago?" "Absolutely no earlier, no later." Lime became worried and began to speak haltingly, choosing his words. "The Lord urged me, answer honestly, no lies. And if the young man deceives, he will not forgive him." Satya's eyes bored into the very depths of his soul. The hero had never seen anything like it. He couldn't even bear to imagine what the aristocrat might do if he lied. And once the shock passed, Lime, still trembling, confessed that he was telling the truth. Satya calmed me down and lowered his hands. When he met the young man's eyes and saw they weren't lying, he believed. The Lord thanked the guest warmly for his honesty, said he only wanted to make sure of one thing, and with that the tea party resumed. Lime fired off question after question about the aristocrat's behavior, and from Satya's reaction it was clear the aristocrats already knew about the adventures. Satya suddenly grew eager to hear every detail. Back at the table, Language lifted his teacup and, while sipping, reminded everyone that the mole and the others had acted foolishly. It was no surprise they got what they deserved. He figured they truly didn't understand every part of the good growth skill, so they kicked the hero out. Something felt off to him. Propping his face on his hand, the Lord told the guy about it, and he couldn't help wondering why. Usually after Exile, people took up new work, so the young man had to grow up right along with them. The aristocrat asked him if he hadn't trained and fought in the squad, and he answered no. Lime was used as a training tool. Satya couldn't help imagining other jobs besides fighting. Maybe the young man had to be a model or something like that. There really were requests, but the mole told Lime not to do it, saying it wasn't suitable for their level. The Lord realized the squad didn't want the guy to have his own money or his own experience. Lime felt a jolt of alarm. He couldn't figure out what the other person meant by that. The aristocrat suggested the young man imagine for himself what would happen if he tried to do everything alone. The Molinist comrades were terrified they'd run out of time to raise your boyfriend's level, so they kept him close before they reached their peak. Satya realized the truth. They stopped him from doing anything, and worse, made him believe he was helpless without them, all for their profit and their own growth. The faces of those people and their hurtful words flashed back into Lime's memory with renewed force. Their behavior spoke volumes, and hot anger rose in him as he slammed both fists on the table, cursing angrily. Language asked the guests not to get too angry because it didn't suit him. But rage clouded the hero's mind. How could he not be angry at them? But the Lord himself didn't see leaving the squad as a bad thing. Quite the opposite. Being kicked out turned out to be a blessing, because that's how they were able to meet. The Lord held out his hand to the hero and told him not to worry. He wouldn't kick him out for no reason. Lime, surprised that the Lord needed people like him, thanked the man. The young man decided to ask him, nervously, whether they were familiar with the mole. The aristocrat rose from the table again. They only really knew each other a little, and he made clear the case had happened 3 years ago and had nothing to do with the young man. Lime couldn't stop wondering what had happened 3 years ago. It was a touchy conversation, so Satya kept her mouth shut. She didn't want to bring it up, and the hero himself wasn't involved. The young man didn't push it. On the one hand, the Lord was right. He himself hoped never to cross paths with the mole again. The aristocrat shifted the subject on a whim and, with a sudden jolt of memory, realized the guy still had to make a list of necessary things. He felt he ought to have needed resources and children's clothes. It felt like there were so many things that asking for everyone would be indecent. But Satya thought it best to find out right away. After all, the guy wasn't the only one. Some of the residents had already been talking about rebuilding the house, because with the birth of their grandson, they suddenly needed more space, and Lime wondered if the Lord was helping them. If those demands were reasonable, Satya wouldn't refuse, but of course he didn't see the point in pressing. Being persistent would feel intrusive, and everything depended on the tax balance. The aristocrat urged the hero not to be shy. He was ready to listen. Lime felt awkward asking, but he asked for the hammer anyway, his voice small and hesitant. The Lord hadn't expected to hear that exact request. The guy explained it was in a barn falling to pieces, ready to collapse at the slightest breeze. And suddenly everything clicked for Satya. This was all about how the pasture was run. The Lord clapped his hands in agreement and offered to build a new cowshed and take care of everything it needed, and the hero hadn't expected the man across from him would actually do it all. He fumed. He'd counted the needed supplies, and there was enough for him to simply restore. Satya asked him if he understood that they were on the island. He said craftsmen and materials would come from the mainland, so doing everything at once would be cheaper, and it sounded fair. Satya, even as Lime's lord, wasn't doing it out of charity. He saw it as an investment. The hero stayed on the island to run the farm, and the aristocrat soon found out just how skilled he was. The main thing was that the guy still had a good height, and if he'd known from the start how valuable that skill was, he wouldn't have shrugged it off so easily. So Language pleaded with the young man to let him take care of himself. Then he offered to discuss the order. Everything was moving too fast for the hero. Could his skill really be that valuable? He still knew so little about him. He turned to his companion, who quickly asked if the young man wanted to hear anything else. His great height felt like a strange skill. Lime thought most people couldn't see why it mattered, but Satya hung on every word of the hero even though they'd just met, and the Lord replied casually while sipping his drink. The answer was in his own skill. The young man's eyes widened in surprise as the young ruler revealed that his power let him quote someone and forbid any lie. Startled, the hero asked the Lord again, and the Lord repeated the same thing once more. Put simply, it was the ability to see right through other people's lies. Lime's eyes lit up with an idea. It turned out his words and abilities were visible too, and Satya quickly realized the young man wasn't cheating. He believed him right away, and the aristocrat breathed easy. If the young man had lied about his abilities on the papers, he would have treated it like a crime, and Lime would have fled the island in a heartbeat. But this language skill did one thing and one thing only: recognize lies. So he breathed easier, genuinely glad to hear the young man's story. Hearing exactly how the hero had ended up on the island filled the Lord with a quiet joy. They were happy to have had the chance to get to know one another better. Lime couldn't let go of the question about the mole in the group. A tiny, nagging curiosity kept tugging at him. He felt a knot of doubt. Satya would most likely refuse to speak even if asked outright, but it wasn't a sure thing. The hero stood up and thanked them for the tea. It was time for him to head back to work. The aristocrat simply apologized for the delay. When they parted, the Lord pressed a bag and a book into the young man's hands. Inside were sweets and a skill supervisor, and the guy asked if it was definitely possible to take it. He thanked the friendly host and explained that the children would be delighted. Satya himself was grateful to the guest and would be happy from time to time, and the hero would improve his skill. The young man returned to the farm and found Millie and Ryu hard at work, so he shouted to grab their attention and tell them he had come back. The guy snapped at him for being late, and the girl was outraged, fuming at the idea of what he might have been doing there all that time. Apologizing, Lime handed them a bag, a little treat of sweets meant for Mr. Satya. Then he reminded them to wash their hands, and the children, obedient as ever, rushed toward the well. After that, the brother and sister stepped forward to report to the young man. showed their clean hands and received sweets. In the blink of an eye, it was all gone. They begged for more, but the young man said there was nothing left. Million Ri Kang are feeling low, forced to make do with it for the rest of the day. Lime thought about the sweets. They weren't usually this fancy, but he wanted to please the children more often, so he had to figure out what to do with it. Meanwhile, high in the distant mountains far from Harmoa Island, the adventurer squad was already beginning to crumble as their strength failed them at the worst possible moment. A huge monster loomed over the three of them, hissing from its mouth as they stood at its feet. One shouted that this was impossible and demanded to know why. The second said that even against a dragon like this their attacks did nothing, and the girl beside them was just as annoyed. The monster's paw loomed close to the people and they jumped back, screaming. Jack called the mole, who shouted that he couldn't do anything and told Emily and Jack they needed to back off. He'd noticed all the strange things lately. Fights had gotten surprisingly tough, and a dragon of this level should have been down in under 10 minutes, so what's going on? Sitting in the house, Jack slammed his fist on the table, cursing and shouting, "What the hell is going on?" While Emily herself stared in confusion. Her magic wouldn't work, something that had never happened before. He didn't want to believe it, but he suggested the guys check the level anyway. Emily asked again, and Jack said they were already at their maximum. The mole said they were just playing it safe and ordered Emily to fetch a level meter. She didn't understand why she had to, but she went anyway. A level meter is the item that shows an adventurer's level, the kind you usually find in big hotels. Jack sounded less confident, saying that once the O level rose, it shouldn't fall, right? The blonde man's eyes widened in horror when he saw the meter read 65. Jack shoved the guy aside in fury, yelling it was a lie and that he'd try it himself, but in the end Jack and Emily were on the same level. The girls touched the ball and shouted that it must be some kind of mistake. Jack asked if the meter was broken, and the mole said no. If anything, they'd clearly grown weaker, and he couldn't understand why. When he checked last time, it read 100, so he kicked Lime out, and then his skill stopped working. The mole wondered if good growth really only supported their level while he was around. Did everything really work that way? Emily asked him if he was serious, but Jack just couldn't believe it. Emily snapped angrily, asking if they should bring him back to the squad. The mole asked, surprised. He couldn't understand how they could do this. They didn't even know where he was, and yet they'd bow their heads and beg for help. Emily screamed that at their current level they couldn't beat that dragon, and if that happened they'd no longer be able to take on S-rank tasks. Frightened, the girl added that, worse still, they could fall to the same level as Lime. The guys looked at her in horror. Jack answered that he couldn't do it. Back then he had barely scraped by, and only now was he living like a nobleman. How could he ever return to his old life? Jack paused for a second and asked if Lime had known this would happen. If he'd sat with them and waited for the right moment to leave at the peak, and then it turned out to be his fault, and Emily shouted that he'd known for sure and said nothing, so it was his responsibility. Emily shouted at the mole to bring the Lime back at once because he must bear responsibility. Jack agreed with her, but the mole thought it was easy to talk about, and now, because of this situation, they wouldn't make the order deadline. Finding the Lime location will be hard, but if you keep hammering it with criticism, it will crack. They've made him completely dependent on them, so as a last resort you can negotiate and pay him well. On top of that, finishing this task is almost impossible. The dragon is far too much for them, so they'll put it off and think about it later. 2 months later, people crowded around the house, shouting in surprise and calling it a great job. Shading his eyes with his palm, the young man said he too had worked hard on the design. Lime thanked him, but one detail interested him. The hero claimed that, because of him, the house had turned into a bright jewel of a mansion. The young man shrugged, calling himself merely a generous sponsor and asking if he could spend the night. Lime agreed, of course, as 2 guys bounced on a soft bed, and thanks to that help, their lives began to improve. And that's not even counting the new barn and cow pen, plus a brand new chicken coop. Actually, Satya suggested all this. His interesting suggestion was to have chickens. Lime asked why he was being so sudden. Satya said he just thought that if there were milk and eggs, you could make lots of delicious things, and Lime likes that. He replied that he was fine. Satya lifted the basket and said he'd barely taken the chickens, which shocked the hero, and the girl squealed that they were so cute and wanted to care for them, grabbing Lime by the sleeve to ask if she could, and he quickly agreed. Thanks to Millie's care and the effect of the good growth skill, the chickens he started breeding shot up into wonderful hens that lay every day, and everything is getting better. The girl set a milk can and a basket of eggs before him, eager for him to make omelets and pancakes. Lime smiled. Both sound delicious, and Sia asked if it was really lunchtime. Turning around, the young man said they had finished for today, and that next week he would order milk from them again. They'd finally started selling milk. The cows were fully grown, The milk amount had risen greatly, and the quality was impeccable, Satya confirmed. Everything is going incredibly smoothly. They get glowing reviews, and thanks to the trade they can buy vegetables, flour, and even livestock. Lime stared at the house and murmured that he'd long forgotten the taste of omelets and pancakes, when a sound made him spin around, startled. A young man came running straight at him, shouting apologies and begging the hero to sell him milk. He barreled over, breathless, blurting that he'd heard the milk from Haramoa Island was incredibly delicious and wanted to buy some from his master. The hero was shocked and asked him not to shout like that, but he kept yelling for the hero to sell him everything he had left, and Lime thought the guy was definitely crazy. The young man shouted that he'd heard the milk from this island was incredibly tasty and he was ready to buy it all. Lime, confused by the other's excitement, asked him not to make so much noise, otherwise the cows would be scared. The hero didn't know who the man was, but he seemed decent. Lime said they'd sterilize the milk starting at noon and only then begin sales, and the stranger burst out screaming that he couldn't wait, even though the milk must be boiled for 30 to 40 minutes to be sterile. Lime said he couldn't help. They didn't sell raw milk, and the man yanked the bucket from the hero's hands, shouting he'd take his money, no problem, he just needed milk. Lime asked what he was doing, and the guy replied that the hero had let go of the bucket because his master needed this milk and he had to get it at all costs. Lime couldn't see why he should care, even as he watched the milk about to splash out. Lime couldn't understand why he was in such trouble. When he was called from the side, he turned and realized something was wrong with the cow named Shiro. Distracted, he accidentally let go of the bucket. The intruder toppled backward. The bucket landed square on his head, and Light cursed in his mind when he saw the fresh milk spill. Children came running toward him, shouting for Lime to save them. Otherwise Shiro would kill them all. Light asked me to wait. Shiro was a kind-hearted cow, and because she was so huge, Millie had named her Shiro. Hiding the children behind him, he warned them not to scream. Any sound would only make the cows even angrier. Smiling, he called to the cow princess and gently asked what was wrong and what was worrying her, and Krova hummed back at him. Lime reassured her, saying everything was fine and nothing here was strange. Well, except for that person, of course, but that was Lime's problem. He told Shiro not to worry and to go back to the barn, and the cow obeyed. Lime wiped the sweat from his brow, let out a shaky sigh and thought everything was fine, until he saw the guest still hadn't gotten up. He pulled the bucket off the victim's head and asked if he was okay. The man, wide-eyed and shaking, gasped in shock and asked what it had been just now. The hero explained he'd already blacked out and told him to take the rest of the milk. The man shouted that they didn't have enough ready-made milk, and the hero shot back there would have been more if he hadn't spilled it all. The guy started bawling, saying he had come straight from the capital and all for the sake of this milk. Lime only replied that he was unlucky then. He stormed off, fuming that the lime made it too heavy and swore he'd report them to his lord, while Millie stood baffled by his anger. The child beside her sneered and offered to kick him, but the hero just said it wasn't necessary. The hero tried to calm the guy, saying the milk could wait and he was just relieved nobody was hurt. Then he called out to Ryu and Millie, warning that if the cow was truly angry he couldn't hold her in a situation like that, and they needed to calm down and lower their voices. He also told them, "Whatever happens, don't run. Just be gentle." When the children heard his advice, he suggested they go out to eat and ask whether someone would make omelets and pancakes. A week later, Lime brought the man a can, saying there was milk for the week, and the young man thanked him, surprised at how many there were. Lime nodded and said that, really, milk supplies have surged lately. Everyone on the island is buying it. But there's only so much anyone can drink or use. The young man warned they might end up swamped by overproduction, forced to dump the surplus. Aristocrats have special ice chambers, but most things are kept at room temperature. In the hero's previous life, there were things much like the local refrigerators. The hero's face lit up with an idea, and he asked Madi if he had a nice chamber. Madi said he did, and the hero said he'd like to use it for a bit, and that he'd also need sugar. When Satya heard him mention the camera and sugar, Satya understood everything. He asked the hero if he truly wanted to try cooking something interesting, and the hero beamed that it was a delicious treat he could make from leftover milk. Satya agreed, saying the ice chamber and his food supplies were at his disposal, and the hero thanked him, promising he'd repay him later. Satya waved it off. There was no need to thank him. He only hoped the hero would share some of the delicious food with him. Then he decided to get started and told me that the warehouse and the camera are in the back of the house. They were given sugar and a camera, and everything in the pan just needed a few gentle stirs with a spatula so it wouldn't burn. When the milk takes on a light brown tint and thickens just enough, it's slid onto a tray, and he whisks it off to the ice chamber. Satya asked what it was, and the hero smiled and called it fresh caramel. When it cools and hardens, you can cut it into pieces and eat it, he said. Satya said he had never seen anything like it, and the hero claimed it was his original dish, but he lied. It was actually a product the hero had made in a previous life. After a while, the hero knew it was time to return to the farm. He told the guy he'd come by sometime, and Satya called out to Lime. Satya asked if Lime had a lot of ingredients at his disposal. Could he make anything besides sweets? The hero asked again. Satya said that lately butter and cream pie was all the rage on the mainland and tasted amazing. Lime said the ingredients were there, but it would be hard without a recipe, and when he asked me what the pie looked like, Satya decided to draw it for him. When the drawing was shown to the hero, he said it was a round pie with cream inside. He stared at it as a flicker of recognition came over him, and he tried to remember. The hero's eyes widened when he realized it was maritoso, a dessert that was popular in his world. He could hardly believe it existed here, and Lime warned it might be possible but difficult, admitting he wasn't sure he could bake good bread. Satya said they'd better turn to Tommy. He has the best bread and is a miller. But Lime replied that it would be wrong to distract him from his work on a whim. Tommy runs a small oven on the island, baking affordable loaves for the neighbors, and he's the only baker there. The hero said he delved into the topic because he wants to develop products that will actually use excess milk, and bread just doesn't fit the plan. Satya, frustrated, asked if he really wouldn't cook that dessert after all. That was all he had done for him. He added that even after he tried so hard and spent so much money to make the hero happy, he only asked for one cake, sadly. The hero was surprised by this power of persuasion, because now he couldn't bring himself to refuse him. The hero still agreed, promising he'd try, and Satya threw her arms around him joyfully, telling him how happy he was. He thanked Lime, voice warm, and said the cake actually brings back memories. It was the last thing he ate with his mom, the moment unfolding in front of everyone. She seemed harsh and demanding, but in truth she was kind and gentle, and the hero understood him. Satya left, asking him to do his best, and he would definitely try his caramel. The hero was sure it was some kind of blackmail, but that wasn't even the point. Standing in the kitchen, the hero said that if it brings back such important memories to Satya, then he must try. It's time to start. First, he made the dough by pouring in wheat flour, sugar, and salt. Then he added the yeast, milk, and eggs, mixing them well until there were no lumps. He folded in the butter as he mixed and spread the dough, when Ryu came up and asked what he was doing. The hero said Mr. Satya had asked him to bake a cake. The kids wanted to try it too, but he wasn't sure he could, so he decided to make better caramels for the children, who didn't even know what they were. The hero let the dough rest, then pulled them apart, shaped them, and carried them to Tommy. He apologized to the man, explaining that the Lord wanted bread and asking if he could bake it. The man happily said he would rely on him. While Tommy was baking bread, the hero returned home and made fresh cream. When the milk turned to cream, there was nothing left but to beat the sugar and stir until it dissolved. The hero's hands were tired, but he needed to speed up and keep whipping. The hero remembered an automatic whipping machine from his memories that did everything on its own. But after all the hard work, he wished for a magic tool. The cream was finally ready for Tommy's bread. Now he had to cut this bread in half, fill it with cream, and sprinkle sugar on top. After a little while, Satya stared at the dessert in his hands in amazement, hardly believing it had actually turned out. Satya admired the finished dessert and told Lime he was a genius. He beamed, pleased by the compliment, but said he probably couldn't make that dessert all the time. It took a very long time. The man thanked the hero for trying to help with his request and asked if they could start already, and the hero replied, "Of course." And after tasting the memories a little, he could feel Mr. Satya's feelings. The boys sat in the garden while Satya carefully speared a piece of dessert on his fork. This was the dessert Satya ate with her mom the last time, the very taste that held Maritoso's memories, and the hero wondered how much of it she had managed to recreate. Putting a piece in his mouth, the young gentleman shuddered, and his eyes watered. He put down his fork and smiled, the taste familiar. He thanked Lime and said everything had turned out very tasty. Lime smiled and waved it off. There was nothing to thank him for. Satya admitted the dessert tasted even better than the one he'd had before, and Lime's eyes widened in surprise. Satya said that back then his mother had little time left, so she wanted to eat whatever she liked. That dessert was all the rage, but he asked the chef to make the cream lighter so it wouldn't strain my mother's body. He was always thinking about her health. Satya admitted he didn't even know whether his care had been right. A week after that meal, his mother was gone, and he still feels a little sorry. He thinks she would have liked this kind of cake better. Satya called Lime, asking if he could give him another cake to put in front of his mother's portrait, and Lime agreed, of course. It had been hard for the hero to make, but he was glad he could please the young master. Satya sighed and apologized for falling apart a bit. The hero said there was nothing wrong with that, and since that was so, he told the guy to try some fresh caramel, which Satya immediately recognized as what he'd prepared earlier. He grabbed one of the sarmos, popped it into his mouth, and was shocked by the taste, admiring that it looked hard but melted in his mouth. He had never seen such a texture before, and Lime said it was something like a family recipe. Satya said it was delicious and could be sold for tea, and the hero picked up on his enthusiasm, blurting that they'd start selling it to the island's inhabitants at once. Satya told me to wait and asked how much one caramel would cost. The hero replied that the price would certainly be lower for the islanders, and Satya asked if he had calculated the cost well, because she feared such a treat would be too expensive for them, since it requires a lot of sugar. The hero had totally forgotten that sugar was valuable, and once he factored in the costs and the cold room space, the figures looked decent. When Saudi said that serious trading meant rethinking the price and aiming for the aristocrats, the hero realized he was right. The hero had only made that caramel to get rid of extra milk, and now everything is turning into a tangle of serious questions. The only rich man on the island is Satya. Trade is possible only with the mainland, and the hero has no noble contacts there to set anything up. The hero suddenly remembered Satya was a noble too, and Mono pressed him about it. He called out to the man, asking if he could help sell caramels to the nobles from the mainland. Satya asked again. The hero nodded, saying caramel and milk each sell well on their own. Yet milk must be used with care. He wanted to go to the mainland to trade himself, but was too afraid to leave the children alone. And Satya understood him. He said he'd think about the hero's offer, asked for a little time, and promised he'd have people who could help with it. Lime thanked him and apologized for putting so much on him. Satya waved it off, saying it was nothing. The hero had already done so much for him, and if selling milk turned a profit, that would just be a nice bonus. The guy suggested the hero try the tea today, grinning as he mixed together several fine varieties, and the hero apologized, but he had to go back because his children were waiting for him. Someone asked, "Satisest, why don't they have another cup later? If the hero wants, they can have a tea party." And the hero blushed and awkwardly refused, saying it was too much, then offered to drink tea at his farm instead, while Satya beamed and happily agreed it was a great idea. The guy said he'd spend the night at the hero's farm today, which left him stunned, and he asked if he was serious. Satya replied they had spare rooms, so he'd stay with them that night and watch how things were done. The hero didn't even have time to answer before the guy darted off, saying he'd bring tea and sweets because he thought the children would be happy. Later at the farm, the children stood spellbound, listening to the hero's explanations. He told them everything that had happened and why Satya had decided to stay the night with them. Satya greeted the children. Ryu asked why the boss needed it. Satya laid out a table piled high with sweets and told the children it was all for them, saying he hoped they'd appreciate it, and the children lit up with joy as they asked if they could eat it all. Lime suggested we work before tea first because it seemed Mr. Satya wanted to see their work. The children immediately agreed, took Satya by the arms, told him they loved him very much and asked him to stay longer, and the hero watched, amazed by him. Ryu got to work milking the cows, and Millie showed Mr. Satya the chickens. After a while, the guy poured tea into cups for everyone. One evening, they sat down at the table, and the hero felt that an occasional break like this was just the thing. About a week later, the hero and Satya Awa sat in the garden, while the young master gushed over the wonderful cheesecake. Today, besides collecting milk, the hero decided to try making a baked cheesecake. The recipe was simple. Mix cream cheese, sugar, eggs, and flour, then add cream and lemon juice and mix well. Next, mix the crushed cookies with the melted butter. Press them into a baking dish. Pour the main mixture over the top, and bake in the oven until it's ready. Satya said Lime was definitely a genius, one masterpiece after another, and even added that the recipe came from his previous life. Lime said they were out of sugar, so they'd have to wait for the baking, and Satya said then he would have to ask someone to deliver the sugarcane. Satya couldn't shake the question of whether it was worth asking someone about the possibility of someone moving. The hero thought it was all fine, but milk production is growing, and even though butter and cheese are made every day, some still remains. Butter is made by whipping milk hard until it thickens, and cheese by heating milk and mixing in a starter culture. If this keeps up, the islanders will really have to throw the milk away, and not only on his farm. Satya Skalim asked if he would take some corn. Satya alone couldn't possibly eat that much, and the locals kept splitting the food thinner and thinner, so he decided to encourage the hero. The hero said they'll all share the food at his house after all. The guy was surprised the hero had the same thing, and the hero explained it was all the influence of his skill. Satya expected this from good growth, but now is not the time to think about it, so he offered to give the corn to the cows. The hero warned it was a bad idea. Cow feed is carefully balanced for nutrition, and you can't just dump extra vegetables on them. Satya decided to trust the hero. The hero felt a sick twist as he realized they'd have to toss the corn and milk too. Then a voice from the side called to Satya that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. The guy froze, stunned. Satya recognized Rode, Rembrandt's son, standing before him. Rode greeted him, saying he'd barely made it out to visit. He'd said he had some free hours, so he turned up unannounced. Satya's face lit up. She was so glad he'd come. He probably looked worn from the long sail from the mainland, and the hero watching him realized this was Satya's friend, and that he too seemed an aristocrat. Satya admitted he didn't have many noble friends, but the few he had were very close. The hero slipped away so they could talk in private. Satya spotted the hero slipping away and called out where he was headed, offering to have tea and introduce them. But Lime said he was important enough to represent him and had to keep an eye on the cows. And when Rodik heard the word cows, he asked again. Rodik's voice trembled as he asked if the hero, the manager of the local Sati farm, could really be praising him, and whether the hero truly had the quote, the growth skill, and those kinds of shots among his possessions. Rodi asked if the hero wanted to join them for 100,000 gold a month, and the hero was stunned by the amount. Rodi then said he was joking. Sati would have killed him on the spot for such an offer, and the hero let out an awkward laugh. All joking aside, having good height is a useful skill, and that's why Sati treats him so well. Radi remembered he should apologize to the hero, but he couldn't figure out why. Rodi called Frank over, beckoning him toward the others, and the hero instantly recognized the man. Frank stood behind Rodiak, shrinking from the hero's piercing stare. The hero stepped forward, a sudden jolt of recognition hitting him. It was Frank. He's the one who showed up at the farm recently, kicked up a big commotion and moved the milk. Rodea apologized to the hero and said that this guy was his servant, which left Lime totally stunned. Roddy realized Frank had inconvenienced the hero, so he told his subordinate to step forward and apologize properly. And after a short silence, Frank shouted his apologies. Frank said his lord had said he was interested in milk from this island, so Frank rushed here as fast as he could. He just wanted to be useful to his lord. Frank knew he'd only caused trouble, so he was harshly scolded and had to offer his deepest apologies. The hero replied that he could hear everything anyway and didn't need him to shout. Frank said he owed his job to Roddy's generosity and thanked him, and Roddy hit him on the head. Rodiak asked what he was talking about and told him not to shout. He shouted an apologetic, "Sorry," again, and Roy sighed, saying it was settled and that he'd carefully educate Frank so he wouldn't cause any more problems. The hero could only agree. The guy pushed the bag toward the hero, pleading for him to accept it as an apology. The hero let out a shocked cry when he saw the gold coins inside and, confused, said it wasn't necessary. An apology was enough. Roddy snapped that they should just accept it. A servant's mistake is the employer's responsibility, and you must understand that clearly. As Lime opened his mouth to object, Sati called to him from behind. Sati told Lime to just take the money. If a subject of one lord is rude to a subject of another, an apology must follow. Those are the rules, and Lime was startled at how serious it all was, so Sati added that refusing a nobleman's favor can be an insult, which is why they often do charity work. The hero understood everything, bowed to Rode, thanked him, and asked earnestly to be allowed to spend the money on food and tools. Rodiak smiled, wished them success on the farm, and the hero suddenly understood why the servants loved him so much. He had a big, generous heart. Lime thought most nobles were arrogant and unpleasant, but it wasn't Sati's status that mattered. She simply wasn't like that. Sati told Rodi he was just eating the dessert that Lime had made, raving about how tasty it was and urging him to try some while he brewed tea with milk, and Rodi liked the idea. Sati asked Lime if he would stay for tea, but he refused. He had to go home if he was late, and the children would swear. Sati replied that he was sorry because tea parties are always more fun with him. The hero was surprised that it could be more fun with him. After all, he doesn't even tell stories. Sati said, "If that's how it is, good luck to the hero at work." He thanked me. As he left, the hero heard Sati invite Roti to stay the night, and Roti agreed. He would stick around for a few days, which made Sati's face light up because he needed to talk to him about something. Later, the hero came home and Millie rushed to greet him. After looking around, he praised the girl for her excellent work, and she thanked him with a bright smile. Millie and Rue are learning fast. Now they can light a fire, put out an oven, and disinfect milk without his help. And the hero praised the girl for even using water to put out the flames. Ryu lugged in buckets, calling out that he'd brought milk. The hero praised him and asked, amused, if he was milking himself again. And Ryu admitted it was true, complaining that the roofs were noisy all the time. Ryu asked if it was enough for today, and the hero said it was, but the boy, who milks too often, shrugged that it just turns out that way, and it's not good. Production keeps ballooning, yet you can't stop milking because if you pause the cows, mastitis begins. Ryu said that when he drinks milk he feels tired, and Mila agreed because milk also helps her, making her hair and skin shine. The hero couldn't help noticing they were always cheerful and healthy. And he felt great too, maybe because the milk was so nutritious, and during the trade he noticed something. People said that when they drank the milk they felt much better. The children grew healthier and their skin began to shine. He'd heard that praise many times, and the milk was truly good. But the cost was a problem for him. If it could be sold on the mainland, everything would be so much easier. But there were problems. The next day, Lime was met with a roar of cheers. Saudi smiled, glad to see the hero, and Roddy beside him remembered the hero had wanted to talk about something. The hero apologized for the suddenness, set the buckets of milk on the floor, and Roddy stared, surprised at how much milk there was today. Lime said they're pasteurizing it now, canning it and selling it. Roddy asked if sterilizing that much milk was hard, and the hero shrugged that it wasn't a big problem. He just felt sorry to throw away the excess. Roddy asked if he was really throwing it away, and the hero confirmed, saying the island couldn't possibly use it all, and it could only be added to other products in tiny amounts, so Roddy said he was calm. Rodic asked the hero if he could sell him the surplus. In other words, he wanted Lime to supply milk to his territory. Lime was surprised. I wondered if that could be done. Satya said he had actually been writing to Rode about milk for a long time, and he'd shown real interest. Rudy insisted he couldn't give his okay until he'd seen everything himself. So he made the trip to the island, and yesterday he finally tasted his milk. It was even better than he'd imagined. Rody drank so much milk tea he couldn't stop. He fell in love with the hero's milk. Satya said he ordered cream soup for dinner in that mood, and Rody said it was just great. He was thrilled. Rodic said he could not see any reason not to deliver such delicious milk to his region, so he came to talk to the hero. The hero was surprised. Satya handed Lime the contract and told him to read it carefully and then give an answer, and Lime thanked Satya for talking to others for his sake, while Satya laughed and said he'd only sent a couple of emails. Satya said Roddy had other things to do, so he brought up the trade issue himself. It was all his doing. Embarrassed, Rodiuk begged him to stop praising him, saying it was just a coincidence of their shared interests, and Lime was touched. Lime thanked him, voice warm with gratitude for all his help. Ruddy said the agreement is still only a draft. If the hero isn't satisfied with the price or the conditions, they'll discuss it later. He thought over the price, decided not to raise it to take advantage of them, but if he set it too low it would come back to hurt him. When I saw the price on the Lime contract, I asked Mr. Rembrandt if he was sure. Roddy thought it was far too low, but in fact that number was 3 times what he charges the island residents. Roddy threw out a thought. Maybe the hero doesn't even know the market price. He said fresh milk was worth a fortune on the mainland, more expensive than beer or wine, and the hero was stunned. It turned out that keeping a steady milk supply is hard during a shortage. Prices can skyrocket, so wasting the extra milk would be madness. You should sell it to them instead. Sati said that Roti was right. Sati said the price wasn't strange at all. Quite the opposite. The hero's price was far too low. For the islanders, the local price is fine, but if you sell to the mainland, you must match the yen they use there. If you undercut it, prices will fall, and mainland dairy farms will suffer. So the hero should simply accept the price, because the Dukela house, rebranded or not, is rich. Ruddy told the hero to sign the contract if he agreed with its terms. The hero agreed, and then I was dumped on this island with no money in my pocket. Reaching the nearly destroyed pasture, the hero had truly accomplished so much. It all felt like pure luck from the moment he stepped onto the island, thanks to everyone he'd met here. The contract was sealed, and Roddy had already chosen the people to handle the milk deliveries. Roddy chose Frank as his confidant, and the hero wasn't happy about it. Frank started transporting milk a month ago, and the hero's misgivings came true. Frank spills the milk and screams, throwing the work off balance as he gets in the way and can't cope with many things. Ryu asked the hero if Frank was going to stick around much longer. He couldn't stand him anymore. He was just too noisy, and Millie didn't like him either. Those two might be better at the job, but Frank is the man Lord Roderick appointed, and the hero says that once Frank gets used to it, everything will get better. They just need to hang on a little. The upset children shuffled away to tend the chickens and milk the milk. The hero watched them in silence. Actually, Lime had become one himself and was thinking maybe he should talk to Sati. Then a scream came from behind. Frank was shouting that there was food on the table, his voice raw with excitement. The hero asked him to stop screaming. Frank said that there is a huge beetle in the field, panic in every word. The hero asked again. Frank ran on, screaming for help. Millie came up to lie. I'm asking what happened. And he told me about the bug. but he had eaten and there should be bugs. The hero couldn't understand why Frank was so afraid. He heard a noise coming from the fields. The hero decided to go check it out and froze as a huge bug loomed into view. It turned out to be not just a bug, but a monster. Millie asked Lime what to do, because the beetle would eat all the vegetables. Lime said they needed to figure something out, but he couldn't defeat such a monster as a human, so he wondered if he should ask to send a hero from the mainland. There was no time to waste. The vegetables would be eaten and the cattle might suffer, so what should I do? Were you called, Lime, to ask if that noise was coming from Frank again? Lime yelled at Ryu to stay away, but Ryu was puzzled. The hero asked the child if he hadn't seen the huge bug. After peering closely at the monster, the boy burst out, bragging about how cool he was. The hero and Millie gaped in shock as Ryu approached the beetle, asked if he was hungry, and offered him a glass of milk to eat right away. The beetle, clutching a little bucket in its paws, drank the milk and made sounds the child took for the name Kuva. After the child stroked the monster and urged him to look. "You're so cool." The hero stood there confused, thinking, "Isn't that a monster?" Ryu told the monster it looked strong enough and asked if it could lift the logs. Beetle picked them up as if it were nothing and re-invited him to work with them, while the hero stood there, still in shock. Ryu urged Lime to leave the bug with them. He'd take care of it. But Lime stood there puzzled, not knowing what was going on, when Satya slipped up behind him and called out to the hero. Satya said he'd heard something had happened at the farm, and it turned out to be Hercules. Satya said that actually yesterday someone reported a monster in the forest near the port, so he came to warn us, but it turned out to be a rhinoceros beetle-like creature they call Hercules. It mostly eats plants and is pretty peaceful. The hero asked if it was possible to keep him since he was peaceful. Satya replied he wouldn't recommend it. It's quite massive. He added that the cows could get stressed because of him, and suddenly they'd run amok, which would be dangerous. The hero told Ryu that Satya was right. Were you starting to get angry? You couldn't bring yourself to expel the bug. It was obedient and listened to him. Lime reached for the child, begging him to understand the danger if the bug raged. But the child insisted it wouldn't happen to him, and besides, if they didn't keep him, where would he go? Ryu shouted that the hero had been kicked out once too. Did En really want that fate, stuck in a bug? The hero remembered that and realized his own fate was much the same as that hero's. What if they throw him out? He'll end up wandering from farm to farm looking for food, and sooner or later he'll start attacking and stealing it. The hero decided it was better to feed himself and put him to useful tasks. Ryu called Lime and warned that if he was going to kick him out anyway, En would leave too. Lime looked at Satya, who sighed and complained. This was a very sensitive situation. Satya sighed, saying there was no choice but asking them to remember the island needed a hero. Lime apologized and then told Ryu he didn't want him to leave. Lime said Ryu was responsible now and had to promise to look after the beetle, and Ryu shouted with joy, telling the beetle that Lime had allowed him to stay with them. After high-fiving the beetle with his palms, Ryu said they'd better work hard now. The hero couldn't miss it. Ryu was completely transformed. It seemed the hero had no choice but to accept it. And so a strange new friend appeared on the farm. A few days later, Satya asked the hero how he was doing and how the monster was getting on, and Lime smiled, saying the monster was a real hard worker, great at carrying loads and loosening the soil in the fields. Satya tilted her head and asked the hero if he was really that kind, then warned him to be careful anyway. Lime noticed that the main problem was actually in the Frank. Satya asked what happened. Lime said, "To be honest, everything is bad. Frank can't work properly." The hero decided to be blunt and asked a friend to ask Mr. Roderick to replace Frank, and Sadie promised to try. But don't get your hopes up. Satya admitted he wasn't sure Roti knew Frank would turn up like that. It was only his guess, and when Lime asked what he meant, he said Roti's skill was called talent review. Roti could size up someone's skill and character with a single look, so there was no way he'd miss if a servant was fit for the job. The fact he chose Frank proves it. The hero couldn't tell what was wrong, and Satya himself was just as baffled. His skill found no lies about Rode. He'd contact him anyway, and if that didn't change his decision, there was nothing left to do. Satya urged them to think about how they could get along with Frank and said he would help. But a few days passed and nothing changed. Roderick wasn't about to change his mind, and he had no clue what the hero should do with Frank. Meanwhile, at the island's main port, someone called out to Frank, "Do you know where the farm is?" Frank said the man had come to the right place. The fellow worked there and was just about to head to the farm so he would lead the strangers, and the mole thanked him, saying he would help them a lot. Lime suddenly found himself face to face with old acquaintances. The mole greeted him, saying they hadn't seen each other in a long time, that he was already running the farm and had been looking for him, and the hero recognized the mole. Frank happily said that these people said they wanted to come to the farm, so he showed them the way. Then he called himself a good boy and went on to carry the milk. The hero couldn't believe it. Those three were actually being sent to the farm, and it hit him like a punch. They'd lost so much weight, even Jack and Emily, and it had only been 6 months. This was definitely a harmful side effect of his skill. When the hero asked what they needed, the mole shot back that it was rude because the culprit still needed an explanation, accusing the hero of not explaining his skill properly. The mole snapped that he couldn't even imagine someone pulling such a sneaky rollback of forces and demanded to know how Lime had managed to deceive him, and Lime replied that it wasn't true. He himself only learned the features of good growth after arriving on the island. The mole grabbed him by the collar and shouted, asking if the hero really thought those excuses would work when they'd suffered huge damage because of him. The hero snapped back, asking what he was talking about. Jack said it was pretty simple anyway. Emily told the hero he just needed to rejoin their group, and the mole added that even if the hero was still just a weakling, they wouldn't mind if he stayed a servant. The hero narrowed his eyes, stared at them with cold doubt, and asked them again. They shamelessly used his skill, called him a useless parasite and abandoned him. And now they're back all of a sudden because of the progress, can't even regain their strength through training, and have the nerve to say it's all the hero's fault. They're talking nonsense. The mole stepped forward to suggest they work together again, but the hero cut him off, flatly telling them to leave because he refused. The team stood frozen in shock. The mole snapped at him, furious, asking if Lime really thought he had any choice, and Lime shouted back that he was a resident of the island. He even had a passport from the Lord, and he ran this farm so he couldn't leave it. The mole sighed, calling the hero a coward for hiding behind the Lord's power, and with a condescending smirk said he'd give him time to cool down, which only made the hero even angrier. The mole smirked and said that even a fool like Lime would soon see who was right. So for now they'd take a walk. Dinner awaited and he'd wait for his answer too. The hero fell into despair when they suddenly showed up and said whatever they wanted. He screamed and kicked the ground in anger at having let them in. But his answer was still a flat no. Then the kids gathered around. Ryu asked what happened, and Lime calmed down and said everything was fine. Something had happened, but it wasn't a problem. A sudden jolt of memory hit him. He had to tell Satya about this, so he told the children he'd be gone for a while. After a while, Satya asked if the hero was really serious about those people on the island, and he answered yes, telling the Lord not to worry, because Lime will keep working the farm and has no intention of leaving the island. The hero vowed he'd scare them off later, but Satya said he didn't need to drive them away. Instead, the hero was stunned to find himself detaining them. Lime asked, shaken, what it all meant and why they were being detained. Satya said there were a couple of important things not just for him but for Raid too, and the hero, stunned, asked what Mr. Remarant was doing. Satya apologized, voice tight. He couldn't say it was a secret, so he'd head in to text Rhodey, and while he was on his way, the hero needed to detain that company for 2 days. The hero froze in surprise. There wasn't a hotel on this island for 2 days, so he'd have to host them himself, and Satya just told him to manage somehow, because he relies on him. He couldn't understand how it had happened. He'd meant to drive them away, and now he had to hold them here, and he couldn't make sense of what Satya was doing with the mole, or why he had to wait for Mr. Roderick. The hero couldn't stand the sight of their faces anymore, but he had to endure it for 2 whole days. Sometimes Satya gives out impossible tasks. A scream came from the side. The hero recognized the voice. It was Ryu, yelling at someone and demanding, "What are you doing?" The child screamed at the adults that the monster was his friend. So why were they hitting him? The mole replied that they were just getting rid of the monster. The mole bragged that this elite band of heroes cleans up their lands and everyone ought to be grateful. And Ryu wanted to hurl an insult, but a poem sealed his mouth. Lime begged the child to control himself, but however you look at it, Ryu was right. They were way too arrogant. Aim screamed at the monster, shielding the children, his precious family, and warned it not to dare offend them. While the mole replied that if the hero had just returned, this whole commotion wouldn't have happened. The mole asked about the hero's decision and even said he could pay, but the hero shouted that he would not go because he had a farm. Emily's anger flaring, yet the mole stopped her before she could finish and said that Lime still needed to think. The mole said there were no hotels on this island at all and, accepting that they would have to stay with him, asked the hero if he minded because the locals should receive the heroes with hospitality, and the hero remembered Satya's order. The hero agreed and told them to use it as they wished, because he thinks that if he refuses, it will cause trouble for the other islanders, but the children were against it. Lime said he didn't want that either, so they'd sleep with the kids together. They agreed, and evening settled in. The hero apologized to the children for making them worry. Ryu said he was fine, but his voice went cold. He hated that the hero was in trouble because of these people. Millie asked if those people really wanted the hero to leave with them. If so, he could just slip out, come back for a little while, then hurry off. They'd wait and look after the cows themselves so we wouldn't have to worry. He hugged them to say thanks, and even when they're worried, they still think about him. He told them everything was fine, that he loved them, and that whatever happened, he'd always be with them. Ryu said this tattered straw maid reminded him of the past. The hero had made it when they first met. Lime hugged the children tight and urged them to go to bed already. They have work waiting for them tomorrow. For 2 days straight, the mole and his gang kept pestering the hero and getting in his way, and by the end he was even forced to cook for them. Satya was still missing, and he had reached his limit. On the 3rd morning, the company returned to the hero, and the mole leaned in and asked, "Have you changed your mind yet?" Lime said he was busy right now and asked them not to talk to him. The mole shouted, begging him to at least listen like a normal person, and Jack spat that Lime was an idiot who couldn't hear them no matter how hard the mole tried. Jack decided it was time to persuade him with a bad deed. Emily agreed with him. The hero was stunned to hear them. These heroes aimed a weapon at an ordinary person and threatened them. Lime sneered, asking if they weren't ashamed. People who couldn't live up to their own words. So why should he listen to them at all? Jack finally exploded in anger, brandishing his weapon and shouting that he would make the hero understand his situation through pain. The hero froze in surprise when he saw Jack was too slow, watching the axe's arc like slow motion. And with time dragging and nothing to protect him, he slammed his fist into the thug's face. Emily and the mole stood frozen, utterly shocked by what lay before them. The hero couldn't make sense of it. They suddenly felt so weak, even though the hero had been getting pumped from hard work on the farm. Could they really have lost that many levels? Emily shouted at Lime to stop, poised to defeat him with her magic. When the hero heard, he realized how bad it was. Emily is furious, so what should I do? From the side, someone called out that it was terribly noisy and asked what they were doing. Emily turned around and asked the stranger, "Who are you?" Satya snapped back that if you're asking someone's name, it's annoying to make them introduce themselves first. That's just basic manners.